What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode here of the BlockHash podcast. Today, I have on one of the co-founders, Alex, here to discuss Parfin and their launch of Rayls. Parfin is a leading fintech company that provides digital asset custody and blockchain solutions to traditional financial institutions. And we'll be getting into Rails a bit more here in the episode, and I'll leave that up to Alex to give us a bit more details underneath the hood. Alex, welcome to the show, man. It's a pleasure to have you on today. How's it going?
Hey, Brandon. Yeah, no, my pleasure. Happy to be here.
Likewise, pleasure's all mine. To get things going, let's talk about yourself a little bit. First, I think people would love to know a little bit more about your backstory, maybe how you got into the Web3 space and what your journey's been like.
Yeah, sure. So I studied engineering, electrical engineering, and physics at uni. Always like computers since I'm a kid, you know. And then I went to work with software development for a while, and then eventually I joined Siemens, which is this kind of German conglomerate. And in Siemens I got into sales and marketing and eventually product. And so I fell in love with product management. And I was in Siemens for like over a decade. But then in the midst of that, in early 2013, I heard about Bitcoin. And Bitcoin just has all these elements that I like. It's a mixture of computers and economics and game theory and all of that, right? And so I got fixated, let's say, with Bitcoin the moment I read about it, and I started mining Bitcoin from my shed back in, I think it was March 2013. And back in the day, you could still mine with GPUs. And I had some spare GPUs because I used to play lots of like games, and so I built this rig and I was mining it, and it was this like you'd feel like you were kind of printing money almost, because like the thing was you're just trying to pay the electricity bill really, but then there was a little bit left over in the end of the month, and then this thing evolved. Eventually I had an ASIC. I mean, things changed, but one of the things that it happened then too is I joined the Bitcoin Talk forum, which is the place that like everyone was, because the community was not as big as it is today. And there, eventually, I heard about this conference in Miami called the North American Bitcoin Conference, which happened in January 2014, and I went. And I met Vitalik, and that is the conference that incidentally is when he launched Ethereum, right? And so I was there in the audience when he launched it, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I missed this. This sounds amazing, right? Because back in the day, people were talking about this idea of Mattercoin and how you could make Bitcoin a bit more programmable and stuff like this, and Ethereum just kind of crystallized all of that. So I invested in the Ethereum ICO. And that again, turned out to be like a very good investment. And then from that point on, I was hooked, right? And I was like switching more and more into working full time in crypto and Bitcoin and all of that stuff. I built quite, a few companies. I sold some. Eventually, I built this, service called CoinSchedule, which became the biggest ICO portal in the world. So, like in 2016, 17, there were more than like 5,000 ICOs passing through it. And then 2019, I met Marcos, who's the CEO of my current company, Parfin. And the thing is, like I'm coming from this angle of being like an engineer, software developer, kind of crypto OG. And Marcos, he used to head up he used to be a CTO and COO for an investment bank, the biggest investment bank in Latin America. And he had like teams of like thousands of people, traveling all over the world to set up the bank in different countries and so on. And at that time, most of the people coming from what we call TradFi, they would look at crypto and Bitcoin and dismiss it, right? They would say, oh, this is never going to work. But Marcos was different. Marcos was like, my gosh, this is definitely the future. I'm convinced, right? He was like this back in 2019. And so we got together and we realized that what was missing, and actually still is missing, is infrastructure to enable financial institutions like i.e., TradFi institutions to actually use blockchain. And that is the thing that we set out to do, and that is what Parfin is. That was the start of the journey, let's say.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, we have a little bit of a similar, I think, backstory to getting into this space. Definitely got into 2013 as well with Bitcoin and participated early on with Ethereum, and that panned out pretty well. So both of us have probably seen the space evolve quite a bit over time, and it's awesome to see it get to this point where there is this like institutional demand to be in the space and looking for infrastructure and ways to participate. So it's been an awesome journey. In terms of Parfin, was there like a particular inspiration that kind of spurred that on for you and Marcos when you co-founded it in terms of wanting to do this for financial institutions that stem kind of from your background and whatnot, being at Simmons and whatnot? Or was there something else in particular that made you want to go this route?
No, I think for Marcos it's more clear because he was coming from a bank, right? So it was just natural that that is the thing that he understands. For me, I think it was more to do with the fact that I've been kind of setting up companies and building things in the space. And because I'm not coming from a financial background, all of this kind of regulatory stuff and like how bankers think, this is all a little bit alien to me. But of course, I could see that that is the direction things were taking, because if you really want to kind of bring all the liquidity of the world for people to trade in crypto, all the liquidity is actually in TradFi, right? I mean, it's just like orders of magnitude bigger than what it is in crypto right now. And then also like all the people are there, right? Like so banks have 6 billion clients and crypto has, I mean, difficult to measure, but somewhere around like 100, maybe five, some people say 500 million users. I mean, difficult to know, but I would guess more towards the lower number, especially if you talk about active users. And so, to me, it was just kind of obvious going through this journey that if you want this to really be transformative, then we would have to bring all the rest of humanity, into the game.
Absolutely. And it seems like these institutions are pretty ready to go too. There was a Fed meeting recently in the US, and Jerome Powell mentioned that banks are ready to go and well equipped to dive in and start integrating different types of infrastructure in regards to Web3. And CEO of Bank America said that they're very interested as well. Like there's a lot of real demand to get into the space. And I think you guys are positioned very well. And I know you guys launched a new blockchain infrastructure solution called Rails recently, and very interested in diving into that more with you a bit. Do you want to tell us a bit about the core mission for Rails and maybe what the main function is in contrast to being a part of Parfin?
Yeah, so I mean, just to kind of start from the backstory for this is when we set up Parfin back in 2019, we started to develop what we now call the Parfin platform. So it's kind of like think about a mixture of say Fireblocks with Talos. So it's like a brokerage system that comes integrated with an MPC custody solution. But the thing is, we decided strategically to focus in Latam, right? And so Marcos, he was living in London. I live in London, right? So Marcos was living in London back in the day, and then Marcos moved back to Brazil, and we basically did quite well in Latam. I mean, we have major clients with this product, like the Brazilian Stock Exchange, Santander, and even Bitso, the Mexican exchange is probably the biggest in Latam. But it's a Latam based product. But one of the things that happened as we were kind of progressing with that product is we opened doors with many, many banks, not just in Latam, but also in the US and Europe. And we realized that, like what you just said, the banks are ready to use blockchain and so on. I think they were ready even before that. I mean, the impression I had from the last, say, 5 years is that banks, they really wanted to, find something that blockchain is good at and then use blockchain. And I think the impression they have is they have to sit in the sidelines and watch all this innovation unfold in front of them in terms of DeFi and new ways of trading and DEXs and all of that stuff, and they can't really use it. And the reason they can't use it is because of regulations, basically, right? So they were being prevented from using it, and even if the ones that could use it, there was a lot of risks because you don't really know who you're dealing with. I remember that there was this fund that wanted to create a DeFi-based, fund, and they had to analyze how much of an AMM's, money was, let's say, contaminated. Contaminated meaning came from suspicious places like hacks and bad players, like countries that are sanctioned and things like this. And it was like a high number. It was like 30%, and so they decided not to do it. So that's kind of the what we were learning, right? Is that it's not that banks didn't want or didn't like blockchain. They did, but it's just that they couldn't use it. And so what they did instead is they would then go and install a private or a permissioned chain instead, so that they could learn. So they would go and install, I don't know, like R3 Corda or I don't know, Hyperledger Besu, things like this. And the problem with that is that creates like an island. And so it works, but there's not really use for it, right? And it's not connected to DeFi, where all this innovation is happening. There's no kind of liquidity aggregation of any sort. And banks have a hard time convincing another bank to join their network, right? Why would they do that? And so that was the kind of situation that we found. And so what Rails is, and Rails is now the second, our second product, is an attempt, or our attempt, to fix that problem. So what Rails does, it comes with a public chain, and it also has a system of permissioned private chains, but they are made for banks from the ground up. So they are like super fast, performant, high security. They provide privacy. I mean, they tick all the boxes that we found that banks require. And when I say banks, I'm using this term interchangeably with like financial institutions in general. It doesn't need to be a bank. It could be like a financial market infrastructure, like a central bank, for example, or a neobank, or any kind of financial institution, really, or credit card provider, anything like this. And so Rails has these two sides, like the public chain and the permission chain, and these things are connected. So the idea is, if you are a financial institution, you can launch your private permissioned chain, but it works in a way that it's much faster and secure and so on for you compared to other solutions, and it's still EVM based. And when you're ready, this thing comes connected by default with the public chain. So when you're ready, you could, for example, mint a token in a permissioned environment, and then distribute it in the permissionless environment of the public chain, the Rails public chain. And of course, because the Rails public chain is an Ethereum layer 2, then you're kind of part of the Ethereum ecosystem, right? And so you can bridge things around, and of course everything is EVM, so there's a lot of interoperability advantages of being EVM. So that is kind of like Rails in a nutshell. It came from this problem that we found, that financial institutions are still today kind of unable to really use blockchain to their full extent.
Does this kind of encapsulate this concept of UniFi that you guys have with Rails, combining TradFi and DeFi, is more or less kind of a good way to sum up what you just kind of discussed?
Yeah. Basically, that's it. It's we came up with this term UniFi because what we are ultimately trying to do here is this: we are trying to kind of unify TradFi with DeFi, right? And going back to what I said before, like DeFi is where all the innovation is where all the the cool people are, the degens and all of those things, and TradFi is where all the liquidity is. And all the users, basically, right? Because like I said, banks around the world have like 6 billion users versus a few million, 100 millions on the blockchain, the DeFi side. So our idea is, can we combine these two things so that we can bring the liquidity of TradFi to DeFi and bring the users of banks onto the Ethereum ecosystem and the wider blockchain ecosystem, and at the same time open up new revenue opportunities for financial institutions and allow them to access more or to combine their liquidity and offer new products basically to their clients.
I love it. I want to go under the hood a little bit more and kind of peel back the layers here on Rails. And you mentioned this a little bit, but I looked you guys up a little bit and was doing some research. And I guess the two biggest things are the Rails public chain and the Rails private subnets. Can you elaborate on both of these a little bit more and kind of how they power Rails on the back end and why both of them are distinctly important?
Yeah, so what the subnet is, so basically Rails, like I said before, it has two parts. It has what we call the Rails node, which is this permission system, and then it has the Rails public chain. So the Rails node, let's start there. If you combine a few of these Rails nodes together, you can create something that we call the subnet. So imagine if you have a few banks and they all install the Rails node, then they can connect to each other through like what we call a hub and spoke model. So this means they all connect to a central blockchain, and through that central blockchain, which is permissioned, they can exchange messages and send tokens back and forth between one another, right? So one example of this is the work we are doing with the Central Bank of Brazil, where they are assessing the CBDC for the country. And so they have called us, and we have installed this Rails subnet for them. And the way it works there is then the Central Bank of Brazil is running an instance of Hyperledger Besu, which is decentralized or distributed, right? With let's say 30 nodes or validators, and then each bank in the country at the moment we are testing. So there's about 10 to 15 banks running the Rails node. They all run the Rails node, and they connect to the central bank's Hyperledger Besu, and now you form the subnet. And of course, there's some smart contracts and things you need to install as well. And so with that, what happens is if Bank A wants to send funds to Bank B, they can do it with full privacy, because part of our system is there's a mechanism that we install with smart contracts using zero knowledge technology that allows for full privacy of transactions between these two different banks, even though the message is going through the central the blockchain in the middle, the Hyperledger Besu, even though you have decentralized validators. Because this is the problem with this. Usually what happens is when you run Hyperledger Besu, everyone that is a validator, they can see everything. So they can see all the transactions. So imagine if Bank A and Bank B are both validators of the same Hyperledger Besu, and then when Bank A makes a transaction, then Bank B can see everything. I mean, that's just not acceptable. So our system just builds it in a way that provides all this privacy so they can operate. So this is one a piece of work we've been doing with the Central Bank of Brazil for well over a year, almost 2 years now, with weekly calls. There's like a team dedicated internally to building this. And we're working very closely to them. And the other example of this is the work we did with JP Morgan in the US a couple of months ago. There was a report, people can Google it. It's called the EPIC report by Kinexys by JP Morgan. And so there it's very similar to the Central Bank of Brazil setup, but it's just trying to decentralize their what was called Onyx, which is now called Kinexys. It changed names. And so this is what the subnet is. And I think what we did, a bit different from other people is most of the other projects, they start with the public chain, and then the private or the subnets and private chains, they are like a second thing that they launch. We took the decision to do it the other way around, because one of the strengths we have is we have this very strong relationships with financial institutions all across the world. So we have access to them in an easier way than most people. And so by launching the permission chain first, we could install it and make sure there's product market fit and so on. And now we are going and launching the public chain side. So the public chain is, I don't think there's a lot of secrets in the public chain. It's like an Ethereum layer 2 based on the Arbitrum stack, Orbit. We partnered with Arbitrum. We like them very much. We think it's a very kind of battle-tested piece of technology. There was a press release that came out a couple of weeks ago even about this. But I think the distinction for our public chain is that every account is verified. So what that means is for you to be able to transact in the Rails public chain, for you to be able to send the transaction, you need to connect your Rails account with your bank. That's how it works. And so once you do that, then we know, okay, the owner of this account in Rails is also a client of this bank, right? And they have then therefore gone through KYC and everything else with the bank. And therefore this account can be trusted.
So alongside the public chain and the private subnets, and you kind of touched on this a little bit with the privacy aspect as well. But do you guys incorporate any other types of novel technologies like zero knowledge or homomorphic encryption to enhance some of that privacy and security as well?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of that because one of the challenges that we have with what I explained before with the subnet is that you have all these institutions. Imagine you have, like I said in the Central Bank of Brazil case, 15 banks running the Rails node, and it's a hub and spoke model, so they're connected to a central blockchain. But the thing is, when they are running the Rails node, it's running on-prem. They are running it, the banks are running it. And so how can you ensure to all the other participants, all the other banks, that say, for example, Bank A is not malicious and is not modifying their version of the blockchain that they own, right? And so this is a problem that requires creativity and cryptography to solve. And so as part of that, there's lots of things like we send some commits, so homomorphic encrypted commits to this central blockchain to attest to everyone else that, look, this has not been modified. The Merkle tree is still the same as it was before, right? Everything's correct. And we also have a technology that we call Enigma, which is based in zero knowledge, and it basically allows, like I said before, for bank A to transfer funds to bank B in a decentralized environment, and yet an EVM, and yet no one else can see who's sending what to whom, what is the amount being transacted, and what are the balances of each one of the participants. So everything is kept private this way. And this is a technology that we developed in-house. We have a team of cryptographers in-house. And yeah, I mean, this is a very important part for us, because when you work with institutions like we do with the banks and financial institutions, I mean, I'm sure you know this, they are very, very strict on who they allow to work with them and use their technology and so on. There's massive due diligences, and so we need to make sure that whatever it is that we put out has all the security, privacy, high availability, disaster recovery, all of those things that banks require.
And the Ethereum virtual machine, I'm curious why you guys chose that as well. I know it's been a standard for smart contract development for many years and is also facing growing competition in the space. But was there any reason for picking EVM over other chains, other VMs out there, anything in specifically that it made it more appealing?
Yeah, I think it boils down to interoperability and composability, because Ethereum is still the biggest ecosystem. I know that Solana has been kind of growing a lot, but I think Ethereum like somehow became uh, the technology of choice. I mean, when I say Ethereum, I mean EVM in general, the technology of choice for institutions. A lot of the clients that when we were speaking about this with like large banks and so on, they would mention that they would like, the blockchain, if they have a blockchain, that they would like it to be EVM compatible or EVM based, because of this, right? Because then, say for example, if you mint a new ERC20 token for your fund, then if you're not on the EVM technology, well, then you would have to somehow convert it to something else so that people can transact in EVM. Like, I mean, there's Ethereum, there's Arbitrum, there's OP Stack, there's so many chains. And moreover, also with other institutions, they all seem to be converging around EVM. And so if you are the only one not using EVM, I mean, it's not impossible, of course not, right? You can still, like, you can mint a token in Solana and bridge it over to Ethereum. There's a little bit of a conversion that needs to happen, but it's possible. It just makes things a little bit more complicated. Um, yeah, so it just boils down to like what is that the majority of our clients would like to have.
And what real world applications do you imagine coming out of this for institutions that are using Rails? Obviously, tokenization is a really, really big one right now in RWAs as well as CBDCs and looking into cross border payments. Like, I imagine the breadth and possibilities here are quite wide in terms of what they could do with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see ourselves as building infrastructure. So it's like we are not going to dictate the direction that things are going to take. We're going to provide the best infrastructure we can that we believe is the one that institutions need to use blockchain. I think the use case for the private permission chains is kind of clear, right? So as you mentioned, CBDC, internal chains. You could like tokenize things for your own clients. Some of our clients have like our banks with 180 million clients. So that like just one of those banks, they probably have more users than the whole of Ethereum, right? So even if they install one of our uh, Rails nodes, and they could port over, Uniswap in their own kind of instance of Rails, and they could provide a great service to all their users, 180 million users. And that alone has value. But then I think the more interesting thing is what you can do with the public chain and the connection between the private chain and the public chain. And so I think you're right. The thing that we see now that's driving a lot of interest is RWA for sure. And then what can you do with the RWA? Can you use it as a collateral for a loan, for example? We did a project like this together with with Santander and Ave a couple of years ago. And there the idea was, can you tokenize a car? So let's say the car becomes an NFT. And we did all this. This is like a POC that is working and all. and then can you do a DVP, so delivery versus payment transaction with the car? So basically, I don't know how it is in the US, but here in the UK and also in Brazil, when you buy or when you sell your car, used car, there's a kind of a piece of paper that the new owner has to sign and then send it to like the central place, and then the car gets transferred over to the new owner. But you should only do that once you get the payment, right? Because and in Brazil in particular, this is like a critical situation because there's lots of scams and such. And so who does it first? Do you sign the paper first or do you receive the payment first? So this is always this conundrum. And so what we have built with Santander was you can tokenize the car, it becomes an NFT, and then if the money is digital, or either stable coins or CBDCs, then you can do this transaction where the buyer gets the car, the seller gets the money in an atomic transaction, and we even went a step further. We included finance over there. So if the car is financed, then the receivable becomes another token that can be transacted in a secondary market. So we built all that. So that is one example, right? And then you could perhaps take the car and use the NFT of the car as collateral for a loan in something like Aave. But then, of course, we are talking about an NFT, not a fungible token. So there's some work that needs to be done, right? What tests for the value of the car and things like this. So maybe the receivable is the more interesting part here. But all of these things, to do with RWA, this is very, very interesting, and this could be a new service the banks offer. Imagine if you're the client of the bank and you want to take a loan. I mean, the bank would say, look, there's two options. You can take the loan from us and you pay, 5% interest, or you could take the loan from this other place, which is a DeFi protocol, and then it's 3% interest, right? And something like this, because if we have access to broader liquidity and different players, then, you could see things like this evolving. So this is on the RWA side. And also, stablecoins is a hot topic right now. The fact that the Rails public chain is verified, so all the accounts are verified, is a major plus. If you're a financial institution, it would make a lot more sense to launch your stablecoin in a place where every single account is verified. So things like dust attacks should be greatly minimized. There's this famous example of BlackRock launching, the tokenized fund in Ethereum, and then a couple of hours later, someone sent a dust attack at the main address with funds coming from Tornado Cash, right? So things like this, just because Ethereum is this wild west with some accounts could even be verified, but not all of them are, and you can't prevent transactions coming in. So in Rails, I think this risk is greatly reduced. Yeah, and CBDCs, I think CBDC is a topic that is not for everyone. I mean, we know that in the US, for example, people are not very keen on CBDCs. Some other countries, like especially in Latin America, maybe some countries in Africa, maybe some in Europe, there's a bit more appetite, in Asia. We'll see, right? But I think the good thing is that we kind of got lucky in a way that the Brazilian central bank is very forward thinking. And I've been to many central bank conferences around the world, and I think the case of Brazil is always cited as like one example of here's a very sophisticated project, which it really is using EVM in that case, and kind of building a wholesale and a retail CBDC on the same system for 200 million people, and it works. So we got lucky that we had a relationship with the Brazilian central bank. And hopefully we're going to use that as an example for other central banks as well.
Yeah, it's awesome that you guys are working on that in Brazil. They're like sneakily like the sixth or seventh biggest economy in the world. So I think most people don't really think about that too much when they hear about projects in Brazil. But it's really big stuff. And I'm glad you brought up BlackRock as well. So I want to ask you a little bit of a high level view on tokenization and RWAs since they've been gaining a lot of ground and traction with institutions. BlackRock predicting like 16 to 30 trillion dollar market for tokenization potentially as soon as 2030, which is pretty crazy to think about given it's right already 2025. So that's like 5 years. How do you see this tokenization market kind of shaping up here in the near future? And do you think that the infrastructure is there for it to take place? Obviously, institutions have a large appetite for it right now. But outside of Rails, a lot of the stuff is still very new. Just kind of curious on your take, being in this side of the business and kind of seeing things behind the curtain a little bit. Do you think that this is going to be, massive in the next 5 years or so? And what does that look like to you?
Yeah, we always thought it would be massive, and it was always a little bit curious that since the whole STO story started back in 2018 or so, a lot of people have been predicting, what we now call RWAs, but basically any token that is not a utility token, let's say, right? Even security tokens, but also like real world assets and everything that is under this umbrella, that this would take off and so on. And it hasn't happened so far. And I think one of the biggest reasons is because of, like I said before, regulation, right? So I think there was a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty around from institutions around the whole technology, and plus it was seen as this bad thing used by criminals and so on. And I think what changed recently, especially now with Trump coming in, is that he seems to be very pro this technology taking off. He just changed the whole SEC structure, all the kind of regulatory agencies. There's a lot of deregulation happening. So this is all very positive for RWAs and crypto and blockchain in general. So I'm very bullish. I think we started Parfin with this concept of this vision that everything's going to be on chain eventually. Maybe happens even sooner than we thought. But institutions, they move very slowly. So to close a deal with a bank, the sales cycle is like 6 to 18 months. Is massive, right? It's very long, and you have to keep pushing, and eventually it comes through. But with the regulation, there's kind of a race happening, and I think whatever happens in the US has ripple effects all over the world. We can see that in Brazil even, because as previously, even the banks in Brazil, they were a little bit reticent and I don't know if we should do this or not. Now with all that's happening in the US, all the banks are coming to us and knocking on our door like crazy. Like they all want to do projects immediately. They are feeling like they're being left behind. I mean, we heard this from a couple of major banks in the country saying, "Oh my gosh, we missed the boat. We missed the boat. We are so far behind." So there's a FOMO happening now with institutions, and not just in Brazil. This is just a couple of examples. We see that in the US. I mean, the reason Marco was supposed to be here with us, but he just landed from New York. He spent the last couple of weeks in New York, and he had similar reports. It's like very, very similar FOMO happening. So I do think it's possible that that's the new reality is going to be that most things are going to be migrating on chain. And if BlackRock says it's going to be how much, 17 trillion, 15 trillion, I mean, who am I to disagree with that?
16 to 30, who knows?
Who knows? Yeah.
I mean, everything I feel like could be tokenized generally. I mean, it could be a car, it could be a house, it could be gold still in the grounds. I think the possibilities are quite endless. There seems to be a lot of talk around equities and traditional markets, treasuries, bonds. I think probably being the first to go to get tokenized. But I imagine just about everything will go that direction eventually. It's just a matter of time. And it's awesome that you guys are seeing that demand too. I think this 180 in sentiment will be studied one day. There's so many people running away from the US the last couple of years, and now everyone's running back, and it's quite crazy.
I'm considering moving to the US even. Yeah, I mean, it seems to be the new Mecca, right? Yeah, and I think again, my sentiment is there was a latent desire from financial institutions to use technology. I think they just weren't being allowed, and now that the floodgates are open in a way, then all this repressed demand is coming to fruition. I really do think this is what's happening. And again, one other example out of Brazil is we have this system in production already. So Rails, I know that there's lots of like POCs. You mentioned this before too. It's early days, but we do have this massive financial market infrastructure provider called Nuclea, and they process over $5 trillion in payments per year. So they're massive. I think they're the biggest financial market infrastructure provider in the southern hemisphere. And so they have installed Rails, the permission side of it, and they are tokenizing receivables. So they take like credit card receivables and so on. And they tokenize this, and the intention is, creating a secondary market for it. And so you can see, like, and this is in production. They're tokenizing 10,000 receivables per week already, right? And this can become like a massive thing. I agree with everything you said. Is like everything can be tokenized, and it becomes much more efficient when it's tokenized, because it's much easier to buy and sell, to send to anywhere around the world. There's no like geographic barriers, and you can do creative things like DeFi protocols and things, and who knows what else is going to come, right? I mean, there's lots of very, very creative people coming up with new things weekly in this space. So yeah, it's very, very exciting future.
Absolutely. And very exciting times to see all this come to fruition and the amount of value that it will unlock, I think, in static assets that weren't traditionally as liquid as they could be. So I think it's going to be very exciting to see how that impacts markets and what our future economies look like. So it's wonderful times we live in. Looking at your guys' roadmap too for this year, what else do you have coming up? I know you guys have a testnet here on the horizon. Anything else in terms of things that you guys are developing out, new partners, people you're working with? What does your 2025 look like?
Yeah, I think as 2024 was very focused on the permission side of things, and we closed all these deals with massive financial institutions, and we will continue to do so. 2025 is the focus is a lot on the public chain. So we have a testnet that we call Steam. A lot of the things we do, because of the Rails analogy, is based on train. So the first testnet called Steam is coming online in the next few weeks. And it's going to offer some of the benefits I mentioned with the connection with banks and so on. And then there's a second testnet coming online a bit later called Maglev. And then Maglev is the one that becomes the mainnet later in 2025. So that's like a massive focus for us right now. And also, we're going to have a token. So this is, again, another, there's a lot of work to properly launch a token. It takes a lot of effort. And so there's also a lot of work happening there. And again, it's going to be launched around the same time as the mainnet comes online. And if people want to know more about it, the website is rayls.com. So it's RAYLS.com. And there's also documentation, docs.rails.com, for those that are more technical. Yeah, and also we can be reached in Twitter, X. It's Rails Labs. And yeah, anyone, we are happy to talk to anyone and hear feedback as well and ideas.
Awesome, man. We'll put all those links in the description below, so it's really easy for everyone to find when they watch the episode. Are you guys going to be attending any events or conferences coming up? I know ETH Denver is just next week. I think you mentioned that as well. Anything else on the timeline?
Yeah, me and a colleague are going to ETH Denver, kind of last minute decision. We're planning not to go because there's so much happening here. But so today is 2 days before the event starts, and we bought the tickets yesterday. So we're going to be at ETH Denver. Happy to meet. There's lots of meetings already scheduled, but happy to meet anyone there. We usually go to the main ones. So Token 2049 is one that we tend to go. Consensus. Yeah, so the major ones we tend to go. We also are planning to do lots of regional ones for us, even Rails meetups. We did one in Lisbon a couple of months ago. It was very successful. So we're gonna do a bunch of these around the world. Yeah, but happy to connect to people. Probably X the best place. So yeah.
Awesome, man. Let me know how it goes, and we'll try and connect later this year as well. I'm sure I'll be attending some events too. Maybe we'll cross paths once or twice. But Alex, this has been really great. Thank you for taking the time to really dive into Rails and explain it a bit more. And from the institutional side, the demand that's there and the things you're working on and what you're building out in terms of infrastructure, I think will be very important here down the line as some of these things come to fruition, especially in the world of like RWAs and tokenization and whatnot. So it's an exciting time that we live in. Appreciate it, man. Let me know if you're going to be at anything coming up outside of ETH Denver. And yeah, we'll try and meet up at some point, and maybe we'll do an episode in person too.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks so much, Brandon. It was a pleasure.